why do we need to be learning this math stuff? Like, what is the thing going on with like learning math, right? What is the point of this? And so one of the things I remember when I was teaching, one of the things I remember when I was teaching high school was students were kind of going through, and students were kind of asking me that question, like, what are we learning, all this stuff? And I had to look exactly. I was trying to make a direct relationship. And so I looked at my material, and, it was one of those things that it reminded me through my studies. I'm like, this is directly related to creating an argument, right? So, in like in English, they have like an argumentative like essay, right? And when I was in college, actually, I remember I also took a philosophy class, and, a lot of it is like logic, right? And so I remember I was teaching with my students, and I remember one time in the book, it was like, use this logic, or it might have actually been in a proof book when I was in college, but it was like how to win any argument. And the way that we were using this winning any argument, I can't remember the logic that it was used, but it was all based off of logic and reasoning. And it was one of those things where it's like, you can use this technique to win any argument. And the purpose of it was to like win any argument with your parents. And I remember I'm like, this is such a great idea, or a great way to kind of think about some of the things that we sometimes do in mathematics, like that logic and that reasoning. And again, like not just going into proofs, right? Or proving something and stuff like that. But a lot of times when we're doing mathematical content, we are creating we're doing things that are based off of logic, right? We are creating a foundation, a premise, right? And then we're building like deductive reasoning based on that. And that is how we are kind of following through on those steps. And I think it's really, really important that we as a society, or people in general, have a strong understanding of this logic and this reasoning. So not only can we just like understand how I'd say like how the laws of, the world work, right? How things are going to, if A, then B, right? If A, then B, then C, then if A, then B, if B, then C, then if A, then C. Like you can just follow like some of that deductive reasoning, straight in from there. But again, like all like kind of reasoning and all kind of logic, we can have conversations about, right? And we can have knowledgeable conversations about. And I think like one thing that just kind of pops in my head is always kind of comes into one, arguing with your parents, right? We always try to want to win our arguments with our parents. And a lot of times that's a very difficult thing to do, because even if we are logically correct with our parents, right, we don't always have that authority that's going to still win over the argument. But if we can produce a really strong argument, I remember sometimes having arguments with my parents, and I remember I would say something to them, and I remember like, not like I was trying to follow a perfect like mathematical scheme, but I remember sometimes I'd get them to stop, and I'd get them to think, and I'd get them to hesitate. And that always brought me up to a point where I'm like, I'm onto something, right? I'm almost there. Like I'm making a good argument. And I think that's also something very important. Like when we are, having conversations in politics, or like how we should be, getting things done, and like having discussions of where we don't agree on what we need to be doing about something. But if we can maybe agree on the premise, right? If we can agree that like, all right, here is our foundational truths that we are going to agree upon, and then let's go ahead and build up from there, right? And let's figure out what is going to be the best logical way that's going to work. And sometimes the logic is not going to be the same for both people. Like they're going to be like, all right, well, if we're going to do it this, or like not so much the logic's not going to work, but like the way that they want to do it is going to be different from two different opinions. But we can also look at the logic and go ahead and reason. And again, we can go and look at the logic and reason to what is going to make the most amount of sense. Now, again, logic and reasoning is not going to be everything. Obviously, we live in a very crazy and convoluted life, but I think it is definitely something that I have looked on and I've reasoned with. I'm like, man, there's so many things that people say that are like logical fallacies, or that just it just doesn't even make any sense. And I'm like, man, the world would be such a better place if at least we could agree upon people having like a good, decent foundation of understanding like some logical principles, right? Some philosophy of how to build an argument and how to stand behind, that argument. Because if you're just going to say something and you can't back it up, right? That's an issue. That's a problem. And so I think it's very important that is one thing that comes from math, no matter what you're studying. If it's something crazy that you're like, I don't even know why I'm learning this stuff. This has nothing to do with what I want to be, a teacher or a ballerina or whatever may be the case. But that idea of like building those logical arguments. And again, math is not the only way that you can learn how to do this, right? And math is not just like the one course that you have to take to do this, but that is a very, very strong byproduct from learning math. And I think that the higher in math that you go, like obviously when I went into college, like I was taking, I remember taking like all proofs class. That's all we did was proofs, right? And I'm not saying everybody needs to go that far, but I think the farther you go in math, the stronger you are going to have in general, like, broadly, of a logical reasoning. And I think that's sometimes also why we put people that have like a strong math background on a little bit of pinnacle. But again, it's not everything. So not just saying just because you learn math, like that's good, or like you're the smartest person in the world, or you're going to be successful, or just because you're very logical and reason, like that's not, it is everything in life. But it is something that is very important that I do think we are lacking. And I do think that is something that's really a good byproduct of learning mathematics. What was the next thing that I thought I wrote it in from there. The next one. So the next one kind of comes in. It's like, so the next thing about learning math is, I think something we all agree upon, and this is the one that I think most students want to know about. They're like, this is why I want to know what I'm doing in math, right? And the unfortunate thing is like a lot of things that we learn in math is not going to be directly related to going to the grocery store, right? I remember like the biggest joke that I always tell my students, and they're like, why are we learning this? Like, why are we learning how to classify a polynomial? I'm like, well, when you're at the grocery store and you need to pick out apples, and like, it was always like a stupid joke, but it was always like the same thing. I'm like, that's so like, there's so many things that we are learning that you're not going to be able to use, that you're not using in your real life. You're not going to go home and be able to apply this, right? But again, that's not the purpose of education, because I can say that about almost half the stuff that you're learning right now, that you're never, ever going to use this ever, ever again. But math always gets the bad rap. I don't know why, but math always gets the bad rap. But one thing I was related it to was like, if you're playing an instrument, one of the worst things that we have to do on playing an instrument is like learning those like very basic, very basic songs and everything like that. And like, practicing some of your scales and stuff like that. Like all that stuff prepares you to learn how to play really, really good songs, right? But you have to practice the kind of basics. And the unfortunate thing is a lot of stuff we're learning in Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry, that's just the basics. Right. And that's just to prepare you for the good stuff. Right. The good stuff is once you start getting into, the calculus, you start actually seeing some of this higher upper level application stuff. Now, I agree, not everybody needs to take a calculus course and have that application stuff, but that is what some of that foundational stuff is built upon, as far as like preparing you for the good stuff, right? Where you actually can apply and use this stuff. And I do believe, like, I think our society would be better off if students did have a better exposure to upper level mathematics without having such a barrier of a lot of that foundational knowledge that we still just kind of like cram and force students to be able to know. But that's kind of like in a different topic for a different video. The other thing though, I think it's important is, so that's kind of like relationships within that's with relationships within the own math content. The other relationship is like, yeah, how does the math, like, what are the relationships of mathematics? Because if you understand how mathematics is connected, not only like between other mathematical contents, but if you understand how mathematics is related to the real world and how it actually is applied in the real world, like you are a step above. And the best way I can relate this to, and it's not going to be, again, for everything, right? But again, like one thing that I do think that we need to focus or refocus our attention on is that application to math, right? We do want to make sure we're scaling students for the more difficult concepts, right? That they are going to be applying, like engineering, calculus, and everything, and data science, or computer science. But the other thing that I wanted to mention was like the relationship with like probability. Right. And like you go to it, like one thing that would always stick out to me is like, I remember like the first time I remember the lottery got like over $1 billion. And I think they said like your chances of winning were like 1 in 3 million. And I don't know if that was correct, but again, that's not the point. The point that I remember saying was at that certain time, I was teaching my students about compound interest. And I was teaching them about like, all right, if you take this money, right, and invest it, and like, let's just say it's even a conservative investment, like here's the rate of return that you'd expect to do. Like in 40 years, like you're what, 15 years old, you'll be like 55. Like this is how much money you would have, right? But again, like what was taking all the attention? The lottery. That's what everybody was talking about. Like, oh, you buy a $3 ticket and you could win $1 billion. Like it's insane. And I'm not going to lie. Like I would do the same thing. Like even when like my kind of rule is if it gets over $1 billion, like I want to play too. Like I think it's just a fun thing to do. I have nothing against the lottery. But if you're playing the lottery thinking that you actually have a chance, you have no mathematical knowledge of probability, right? And because I remember it was like 1 in 300 million. And like to me, like that immediately, like what I initially thought, I'm like, well, isn't there like around 300 million people in the United States? So that's like literally them just picking one person out of the whole United States population and it being me. And I'm like, that's crazy. That's such a low, like, why would I want to, like, I'm spending money on this because it's extra money that I can afford to lose and I'm willing to do it, right? So I think I spent like $10 or $20, can't remember. But I remember there was other people that were like, they're spending like their life savings or like, grouping a whole bunch of money together. And I'm like, I get it. It's fun, but your probability of winning any money is extremely low. And I'm like, these are people that need some mathematical help, right? They need some help mathematically. And because if they took that same amount of money and just invested it, right, and just used some compound interest, they would have a much safer investment, much safer investment, and also be able to earn a ton of money. And I think that's one of the hardest things that I found stepping away from the classroom is like students always get a bad rap about math. Like, math, it's useless. I always struggle with math. But having a strong understanding of mathematics is one thing that like when you're talking about like money, and you're talking about like the probability and maybe being able to make predictions, right? It's not just about like, oh, like let me estimate the amount of paint that I need on a wall. Like, yeah, that's a cool thing to know. But I think understanding statistics, understanding probability, right? Understanding that that data science is extremely important for you to be able to understand patterns in our world and understand predictions, right? Be able to predict what's going to happen in the future. Having a strong understanding of mathematics to be able to understand how numbers work, how they're related to each other, and be able to make those relationships, those patterns, right? And also be able to like invest your money and not have to rely on somebody else telling you what is the best thing to do for you. You have an understanding of how things are going to work. You have an understanding of if you're getting some good or some poor advice. You can be able to, if you have a strong understanding of mathematics, you can compare products, right? If somebody's kind of fluffing the numbers to make things sound good because you can be able to understand the risk, right? You can understand the rewards. And a lot of people, I think, that have stepped away from continuing their math education they're at a disadvantage in life with that kind of like lack of like reasoning and understanding with how the math is going to work. And again, that's not for all math, right? But I really just kind of, I specifically am just directly talking about the numbers, like with like investing, right? And compound interest. Like if you understand how numbers work and the relationships and everything else, like you can be able to see, you can have a better understanding of how to invest your money and what to do, with those things, rather than just relying on a lottery or relying on somebody else that you're paying money to handle your money. Like, I don't think that's a good recipe of success for majority of people. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people just have to rely on is other people's expertise to help them, manage money correctly. And I think if we are going to be successful on our own, we got to make sure that we can still pay people to take care of our stuff, right? But we also want to make sure that we can understand what they're doing and if they're doing it correctly. All right, I want to talk. Okay. All right, and the last thing is probably the least. The next thing is probably going to be the least, let's say, how can I put this nicely? The least exciting way that you'd want to really learn math. And I don't think anybody's like, raising their hand and be like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I want to learn. Like this is what most students don't want to learn or want to avoid. But I think it's really important for us to understand, like, this is how learning happens. This is how we get better at things. And it all comes down to, knowing, what was my, it all comes down to being consistent. And one thing I wanted to bring in is like when I was in high school, my three sports that I played was football, baseball, and wrestling. I love football. I love the Friday Night Lights. You're kind of treated as like a celebrity, inside your own high school, like just because you play on Friday nights. That's literally the only reason you play a sport on Friday nights. So you're kind of in front of like the hometown crowd, and it's like your celebrity status just because you wear a football uniform. It's the craziest thing, but it was the coolest thing in the world. And our football team stunk, but still, we were still treated like we were special for some reason. But I loved playing under the lights. That was like an amazing feeling. Then wrestling was my favorite sport just because it was like camaraderie of like your baseball team. It's a very low, relaxed kind of sport. And you just kind of had fun with, the guys that are on your team. Like I loved playing baseball. I played it all throughout my whole life. And then there's wrestling. Wrestling was probably my favorite, not because it was my favorite sport, but because I think I grew the most out of wrestling. And the reason why I grew the most out of wrestling, because I had to be disciplined and I had to show up every day, practice in the morning, right? In the afternoon, during the, anytime we had a break, right? We were always doing like in the morning, running. Like I would go out at night and run and run. I had to make sure that my weight was exactly on point. We had to be like disciplined with like learning our moves and going over and over and over and over and over, doing the same moves over and over again to get better and better at them. And it was tough. Like I remember by the time I was done wrestling, I was almost like, even though I missed the sport, I remember like exhaling because I'm like, oh, the season's over. Like it would just drag on you because you had to be so disciplined with what you're eating, when you were eating, right? And, how much you were drinking and when you were drinking water. And then also like all the details with the sport. But it was by far the number one sport that I believe has provided me with like, I would say any success in my life because I had to wake up early, right? There's like nobody telling me like, oh, wake up early. Oh, go home I go home and now go and run like 3 miles and like lose weight. Like, no, I had to discipline myself to be able to do that. Right. And I had to push myself constantly to make sure that I was like staying on weight or that I was improve myself, for my team. Like, and because the best thing about wrestling compared to football and baseball was I was all by myself. Right. If I lost on that mat in that ring, yeah, I had my teammates and like we had team scores and stuff like that, but it was on me. Right. You're all alone when you're on wrestling. And being able to like have discipline, have self-control is an extremely important thing that I think that a lot of us can benefit from in real life, right? Not just about math. And here's the thing about math. If you're going to go to math, you have to be consistent. You have to practice. You have to try. Like, it's not just like, oh, show up in class, man, maybe I'll do my homework. Maybe I'll study once in a while. Like, no, you got to like practice those problems like over and over and over and over. Like when I would tell my students, sometimes I remember like struggling in math, like I wasn't getting good at it. Right. And I'm like, it's just like anything else, guys. Like it's a muscle. You have to prepare and build that muscle. And sometimes that's going to be repetition. And, I'm not like a big proponent of like, we have to do repetition, for everything. And like I said, a lot of it can just turn into busy work, right? If it's not done correctly. But a lot of times when you're trying to learn something, you're trying to perfect something and it's a foundational issue, you need to have that discipline to keep on practicing it. Right. And to do the work that you need to do, you need to have that discipline to not go out and, party or whatever when you need to be studying, right? When you have the test the next day. Like I used to have we had our test on Friday, every Friday morning, I remember. And, it was tough because I was in college and every Thursday night we'd have like friends were over, my friends were going out. And I just had to be disciplined. Like I'm sticking to this. I had to be in my right mindset and make sure I was studying and doing my practice problems, have all my homework done before I showed up to class on Friday, right? So math teaches some discipline. It teaches you to do that work before you can go ahead and show that you have that mastery. And again, I obviously know some people have to do a lot more work than other people, right? To be prepared for either tests or their quizzes and stuff like that. Know a lot of people they don't like it. They want to avoid having to do the discipline. They want to kind of like just get the good grade, show that I can know how to do one problem. So like, give me the A. And no, unfortunately, just like wrestling doesn't work that way. Right? Math doesn't really work that way. And guess what? Life doesn't work that way. So a lot of the things that we learn in math, guys, it's not all black and white. It's not just going to be as like, oh yeah, you're going to learn this, and then this is how this applies to real life, and now you're going to use this for the rest of your life, right? Again, even fractions, right? How many times have you actually used fractions? Like, yeah, you use them quite a bit, but like, it's not crazy, like every single day, like 10 times a day, like you're using fractions, right? So stop trying to, I think my biggest complaint that I have is like, we always try to relate everything that we're trying to learning into like what we need to, everything what we're learning in like a class or whatever, into something in real life. And my point in this video is like, look at the big picture. Look at some of those smaller things that you're learning that are not so much just math related. Like, yeah, the math is important. Like I talked about how you're building a lot of those foundational stuff for like later courses, right? So what you're learning in Algebra 1 might not be totally relevant, but guess what? You're going to need it next year, right? And if you continue on to a major or something else that's going to need some of that foundational information, that's important. But also being able to have logical reasoning and arguments, like that's critically important. Being able to understand patterns and make predictions, that's extremely important. Being able to have discipline and consistency is extremely important. So hope this video was helpful for you. I hope you gained a little bit from it. If you have any questions inside the chat that you want to follow up, put them down there. I'm going to go through the chat now and just kind of answer some of your guys' questions rather quickly. And if you guys do have any math questions that you'd like to go over, then you guys can go and submit your math questions to, where is it? BradMcLogan.com/Q&A.